Hey everybody, Milton Davis here. Um, just wanted to pop in this evening. Earlier this month, I said that I was going to share some of my favorite Black history books. I get asked questions a lot about my books and my references and where I get my information for Sword and Soul and some of the other books that I write. And so I decided I would, pick out a few of my favorite books and share with everyone, which ended up being a difficult thing to do. I'm a history nerd. I love history to death. And actually, I was much a bigger history reader before I became a fiction reader, specifically a science fiction and fantasy reader. But actually, in the 1990s, I went through what I call my African Renaissance. That was when I decided I wanted to learn more about African American history, because being raised up in the school systems that we were raised up in, that's something that we weren't taught. That's something that we had to go out and find ourselves. I had my first experience with Black history and African history was at Fort Valley State College in my history class, and my professor, Dr. Grant, who oddly enough ended up actually was a white guy, taught African history, and that was really my first exposure to African history at that level. And then, like I said, in the 1990s, I decided I was going to go out and do research myself. So I started collecting books. You can see my bookshelf behind me. It's all kind of history books there. In addition to African history, African American history, it's history from all different parts of the world. And all of these books, you kind of helped me develop the worlds that I developed for Sword and Soul and some of the other books that I write. So I got a stack of books here, and they're not in any particular order. I'm just gonna basically show the books, tell you a little bit about them, and tell you why they were important in my research, that type of thing. So the first book is this book called In Search of Canaan. And it's basically called Black Migration to Kansas, 1879 to 1880. This was something that I came across as I was doing my research, which was new to me, and it was basically talking about what they call the Exodusters. This is something that occurred at the end of Reconstruction when the Jim Crow began to settle into the South, and a lot of free blacks were like, look, we don't like this, we don't want to live this and do this anymore. We're going to leave. And one of the places that they were encouraged to migrate to was Kansas. A lot of land speculators had bought property out there, and they were willing to sell it to black families looking for a better life. And the migration was so heavy that a lot of southern whites started to go out to Kansas to see why black people were going out here to this area to settle. And it was a book that really opened my eyes to that part of history. To at that point, I really didn't know a lot about. So again, this one is In Search of Canaan, Black Migration to Kansas, 1879 to 1880. Now, this next book is one that was very personal to me, and actually was shared to me by my father after he read it. And a lot of you have probably already read this book as well. It's called The Warmth of Other Suns. This is one of the best history books that I have in my collection. And it's basically talking about the Great Migration. And this is when a part of history where a lot of blacks started to leave the South again. And a lot of them were relocating to different parts of the country because of, job opportunities and just looking for a better life. And reading this book was almost like reading the history of my family, because all the places that the author, Isabel Wilkerson, focused on were places where I have family members and family members who migrated there for the same reason. She was talking to people that had migrated to New York, that had migrated to Chicago, and had not migrated to California. And I have relatives in all three of those cities, and they all left for the same reasons that I mentioned in this book. And I mean, if you really want to get a good feel for the history of the Great Migration, read this book. It's a great book, really, really eye-opening to me, despite the fact that I had members of my family that experienced the same thing. This other book is also one that was eye-opening to me, and people have been talking about it a lot. Recently people have been talking about the fact that Alexander Dumas was a black man. And what came out more recently was the fact that his father, Thomas Dumas, was actually a celebrated general in the French army during the French Revolution. And this is the book. It's called The Black Count. And this book basically talks about his father's life, talked about how he was born in Haiti and how his father brought him to France. And during that time, France was very liberated, and it was common for French men who had kids in the Caribbean to bring them to France to be educated. And Thomas was one of those people that went through that experience. And when you read this book, you find out that most of the stories that Alexander Dumas wrote were based on his father's life. And it's a fascinating book. This man was a hero in so many ways. He was a towering figure. He was 6 feet tall, and back then a man being 6 feet tall was like huge. So much so that when he was accompanying Napoleon to invade Egypt, the Egyptians thought Dumas was the general as opposed to Napoleon. And that was part of the reason there was some jealousy between them, which eventually ended up leading to his downfall, so to speak. But yeah. The last I heard that John Legend had actually bought the movie rights to this, but so far, this was a while ago, nothing's happened, so hopefully something will. Okay, this the fourth book is a book about a historical black person that there actually needs to be more about, and this is the selected writings and speeches of Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a very important figure in Harlem and in New York and black history in general during the 20s and the 30s. Not enough attention is paid to him about the influence that he had and during that time period. I'm happy that B. Sharice's Moore book that's coming out that we're releasing in April, Dr. Jen's her book about Dr. Jen contains a lot about Marcus Garvey and his movement. And again, it's a person in history that I think more people should know about. This is one of the books to look at, but there's a lot of books about Marcus Garvey. You should check them out. So let's jump around a little bit. Most of you guys who have been, following my books have read Changa Safari. You've read the series. Well, I hope you've read the series. If you haven't, I hope you will. But Changa Safari is based on East Africa, 15th century Swahili culture. And most of the research that I did about Changa I had done online, pulling different various things out. After I had released the books and had really got into the series, I came across this book, which is called The World of the Swahili. And this book had a lot of information in it that I wish I had when I first started writing Changa's book. But it's information that found its way into the stories that make up the Before the Safari book that I wrote, a collection of short stories about Changa and his crew members before the safari took place. Gives a lot of detail about Swahili culture, very eye-opening. So if you get a chance to read it, again, this is another one that was a special book for me. Now, this other book is also a book based in African history. It's actually comes from the Kanem Bornu region, which is part of northern Nigeria. Kanem Bornu were two Muslim cities, multiple Muslim empires in northern Nigeria. And this book is called the Dawan. Specifically, it's the Dawan Revisited. I should have skimmed this before I looked at it, but this book is basically about the dynasty that ruled Kanem Bornu, and one of the longest existing dynasties in the world. It lasted for over 700 years, basically inheritance from family member to family member. And what this book does is that it chronicles each member of that dynasty and gives a little description about their personality and what happened during their reign. This is a book where I got some of my research when I was writing my story for Black Panther Tales of Wakanda. I won't talk about it right now. The book is going to be released on March 9th, and once the book is out, I'll get into a little bit more detail about where my influences came from to write that story. But this is one of them, the Dawan. Okay, I think when you're buying history books, it's really important to buy history books in local places. Every place that you visit, in countries, in states, and cities, they all have history books that are written by local people that go into more detail about the history. And this particular book is one that I found when we were on vacation in St. Augustine, and we visited the St. Augustine Fort. And I was looking through their book collection, and I found this book, which basically told me about something I never knew before. And this is called Black Society in Spanish Florida. What a lot of people are learning was that in the beginning, the Underground Railroad, which wasn't called that, didn't go north, it went south. Basically, when enslaved Africans escaped, they would go south to Spanish Florida, because Spanish Florida had a policy that if you were able to get there, you would be free. And this was during the time when Georgia was basically, the region of Georgia was really a British colony and stuff like that. And this book basically gives a detailed account of the life for freed blacks in the area. This actually led me to looking up an area called Fort Mose, which is basically the first free black settlement in North America. And Fort Mose was established to be outside of St. Augustine, actually as a buffer between St. Augustine and British-controlled America and stuff. And I mean, I learned a lot of stuff in there. There's actually a particular person in this book that his story begs to be told as a historical fiction story, but I'll get into that as well. Now, we're going to jump back to Africa now. In this book, these two books here are very special to me because these books are African history, specifically about the Songhai Empire in the Sahel region of Africa, written by Songhai historians. The first one is the Tariq al-Fatash. I'm give time to focus on there. It's called the Timbuktu Chronicles, and this book basically talks about the rules of Askia Muhammad and of Sonny Ali, and it gives a pretty good detailed account about the history of that region. Now, the special book, this is a special book right here, is the Tariq al-Sudan. It's again about the same time period, spends a little bit more time talking about the rule of Askia Muhammad as opposed to the rule of Sonny Ali. This is somewhat of a rare book. I probably spent more than I should have to buy this book, but it was very important for me to have a book that told about African history, a regional African history, written by the people themselves. And that's what makes it so special. And there was so much information that I learned in this book that was shared in this book that I had never seen anywhere else. So these two books are my prized possessions, as far as that's concerned. Now these next books I'm gonna share to you because they all relate to each other. Recently, there's been a lot of talk about the Minnow of Dahomey, the women that some people know as the Black Amazons. They were an inspiration for the Dora Milaje in Black Panther. They were the inspiration for Charles Saunders' character, Desoye, and they were also the inspiration for my character, Sadatina, in Woman of the Woods. The first book that I read about the Minnow was this book, Amazons of Black Sparta, by Stanley Alpern. And most people who are familiar with the Amazons have learned their information from this particular book. It gives a detailed account about their training, about their culture, and different things like that. But this next book is a really interesting book. I just came across this one a few years ago, and it's called Wives of the Leopards. This book is also about the Minnow of Dahomey, but this book incorporates more of the culture itself of Dahomey, and it shows how the Minnow fit into the entire culture, the influences that they had, and it really gets into a lot of detail about and gives you a little bit more insight of the culture itself as far as just the tactics and the training and that type of part of the Minnow. Now, the reason I showed you those two books first is because there were things mentioned in both of these books that were accounts of basically historians talking to the Minnow, talking to Dahomeans and stuff like that. Some of them were accounts from the British who had a chance to meet, go to Abomey, and you know, and every time you get history from the British, it's a little bit tainted because the British tend to be a little arrogant. But this book right here, which came out a few years ago, Barracuda by Zora Neale Hurston, it was written years ago, but it was just published. And this book actually confirmed some of the information that I had read in the previous books. Cujo, the center of the story here, was actually captured by Dahomians and sold into slavery. And Dahomians led by Minnow warriors. And the description that he gave of how his village was raided and how people were captured fit the exact descriptions that were given in the previous books about the Minnow, but these were like secondhand experiences. This man actually experienced it himself, and so it kind of confirmed what I had read in the other books. It's a bittersweet book. This is a man who experienced the entire condition of slavery in his lifetime. He was captured in the early 1860s, brought to America as a slave, worked as a slave, and then was freed after the end of the Civil War. It's a fascinating book. If you don't have it, please get it. Okay, now I have one book here that I'm embarrassed to say that I haven't read. It's a book that most of my friends who study Black history have read and love it. And unfortunately, my path to Black history came through, to be honest, just white sources. So there were certain books that I didn't hear about until later on. And one of these books is They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima. I'm really looking forward to reading this book. From everyone else that I know that's serious about African history, African American history, this is a book that's a must-have in your collection. So even though I haven't read it yet, I wanted to bring attention to it because I think it's something that that you should have in your book and read, because you have to get the perspective of other people when it comes to history. You should never rely on one particular source, especially if that source will be somewhat biased to what you're doing. Now, let's see. A few more books and I'll be done. This book I picked up as I started doing my research on East African culture. When I started looking at the kingdoms of Kush, of Nubia, of man, I can't even think of the name of it. That's the Mercuria, different kingdoms like that. And this is a very interesting book because it's called The Roots of Nubian Christianity. Now, the Mercurian form of Christianity was basically derived from the Byzantine. There was at some point that some Byzantine monks came down to that area, and the kingdoms converted to the Byzantine type of Christianity as opposed to what they were worshiping in Egypt. However, there was a transition period between the Nubians giving up their traditional Egyptian faith and going to Christianity. And this particular book talks about that. It talks about how even before the Byzantines arrived in that area, the Nubians had already started to convert to Christianity, but it was kind of a modified form, a mesh form, and it gives a lot of insight on that. So it's a great book to read. Excuse me. This book is actually not so much of a history book as it is a book that is about African folklore, and it's called Gasire's Lute. And it's a book that comes from Sahelian culture, and it's basically a book that's supposed to be giving you the origin of the Jele, or the historian. And it talks about a warrior who was vain, and because of his vainness, he sent his sons into battle, and all of them were killed. And part of his mourning process was playing what they call the lute here, but what we would probably know as being a kora or something like that, to mourn their death. So it's a nice little book to have. Now the other books that I have here are part history books, part reference. When you're, one of the things that I was trying to find out about when I was doing my history research is trying to get a feel for the places where people lived, different cities in Africa. So much was destroyed by the British when they arrived in Africa, and gave people this impression that, you know, the Africans were living in the jungle and different things like that. But there were huge cities in Africa, in all parts of Africa, all regions of Africa, but they were destroyed by the British. One good example is that we talk about Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, which is basically a stone city that was found in the region of Zimbabwe. But what a lot of people don't really understand, that there were stone cities throughout southern Africa. There were some actually in South Africa, in the region of the country that we now know as South Africa. But again, these were like structures that were destroyed as they were found, and people really didn't know about it. The name of this book is African Cities and Towns Before the European Conquest. It's written by Richard W. Hull. And basically what this book does is goes to different regions of Africa, describing the type of homes and cities that people lived in the different regions. And it talks about how, you know, all these homes that you find in Africa were basically designed based on the conditions in the country. They worked well for the regions that they were in. They were indigenous designs that took under consideration the rainy seasons, the dry seasons, and different things like that. And it helped me a lot when I was trying to imagine and visualize these different cultures during my writing. You can't have a collection of books of Black history and African history without having a book by Sheikh Anta Diop. Now, if you see this book is beaten up and worn down. It was one of the first books that I bought on African history, pre-colonial Black Africa. You can tell I just kind of went through it time and time again. And interesting enough, some of the information in this book was actually taken from the Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatash. I recognized it as I was reading those two books, and I realized that some of the information that I read in this book was actually taken from those sources and stuff. These next books are basically reference books. They were books that I used to give me some visual references when I was writing my Sword and Soul. And these are like picture books. This first one is called African Kings. And basically it's a book of collection of photographs where the photographers went throughout the continent and basically photographed different African kings in their traditional garb. It's a really good book. It's a mixture of modern and traditional, like this image right here. So each of the sections goes to different parts of the continent and takes pictures of different kings, basically, and their traditional regalia. Like this is a king from Cameroon, you know. So again, another great physical reference. Now this book, this next one, is probably my best reference when it came to traditional Africa. And I remember when the book first came out, I was trying to get a copy of it and I didn't. And then for a long time I couldn't find it. The book had gone out of print, gotten very expensive. But then finally I was able to find it. And this is another book that you got to have in your collection. It's called Africa Adorned by Angela Fisher. And as you can see on the front, as soon as you see the front of this book, you know what you're getting into. I mean, it's a lot of photographs of different people of different regions. Like for instance, the Sahara. Let's see what else we got in here. This is you guys mentioned, like this is something that some of you guys are probably familiar with. Images of Fulani men dressed up during the ceremony when they're trying to select their wives. So it's all kind of photos in here, all kind of different traditional garments, traditional woodwork and different like things from Benin. So this is a great photographic reference for your African, if you're writing stuff based on African culture. There was one more book that I thought I had up here, but I don't, so you're not going to get a chance to see it. But anyway, that is an example of just kind of like a quick summary and read through of the different books that I have in my library on African American and African culture. So there's one more book I want to show it here. Nah, I didn't bring it. But yeah, but I have a list of books that I have a list of all of my history books, all of my Black history books, and I have it in an Excel file. So if you're interested in getting that list, you can DM me or you can send me an email, and I can send that list to you. That list is constantly evolving. As I purchase new books, I put them on the list. And so I have no, I mean, I think this sharing this information is something that I feel that's important in order to expand our understanding of who we are and where we're from. So that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this. This is Milton Davis again, MV Media, and y'all have a good evening. Bye.